Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 3773 East Broadway. This is a live edition of the Jake Feinberg Show. Coming on Power Talk, please go to our website, powertalk.live. Download our free app to your smartphone and stream all of our live local programming, including Solomon on Blast, the Jim Parisi Show, and yours truly, the Jake Feinberg Show. And we can't thank you enough for making us part of your day today. And as I continue to transcend the cycle of birth and death, I do it by accessing wisdom and enlightenment from masters on the bandstand who have either come in contact with or are original source generators of the music that we call jazz, melodic improvisation, and all music. And I get a chance today to talk to a pianist who is really pretty, finds a way to play very intellectual music, but do it in a way where it feels really good. Marc Copland, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thanks, Jake. Good to be here.
You know, I'd be remiss. I wanted to ask you about the first time that you remember connecting with the late, great guitar player John Abercrombie.
Yeah. You know, you're talking about a friendship and a musical relationship that went back almost a half century, and 40 some years. I mean, the first time I became aware of John is when I was in New York, 68, 69, and then into 70 and 71, the Dreams Band, which was Randy and Michael Brecker and Billy Cobham, and these two rock guys. Doug Lubon was the bass player, and I forget the keyboard player's name, but they wrote tunes and sang.
Was it Don Grolnick? Don Grolnick, maybe?
No, Don was later. Don
okay,
was
this is unbelievable. So because you were in New York at that time, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and what happened is they brought in John because they heard him in a rehearsal studio in Boston. He was playing next door, and they heard it and they was like, "Whoa, what is this?" So they immediately got in touch with him and said, "Man, you want to start doing some gigs?" So, I'm still, pretty close to Randy, and I was very close to Michael because we went to high school together outside of Philly.
Wow.
And so I was checking the band out, and John just knocked everybody out, because he was all substance and no fluff, and he added a real thing to the band. And he stayed with it, I guess, several months, and then he was replaced by Bob Mann, who was also a very good guitar player. But
he's a dear friend of the Jake. I love Bob Mann so much. Yeah.
He's a wonderful guy, and he was actually in the band when I ended up subbing for Mike when Mike was having surgery about a year later, and Bob was just a sweetheart and a great player. But I was always curious what had happened, and then a year or two later, so all I knew from John was saying hello to him because, I knew Mike and Randy, and I was a fan of the band, obviously, and then what happened was, so John went back to Boston. I lost touch with him, and a year or two later, it's more like a year and a half later, I was working with Chico Hamilton as an alto saxophonist, and the regular guitarist who had been recommended by Jim Hall, whose name was Lance Gunderson, he couldn't make a weekend in New York, a 3-night weekend, at a little upstairs club on East 14th Street. And the two things I remember are that Lance recommended John. John came down, got himself a room. He came in, he played the first set, and it was like magic from the first tune. And at the end of the first set, Chico walked up to John with a big grin on his face and said, "Man, if you want the gig, you got it." So, I was sort of holding my breath to see what John would do, because I was so knocked out by his playing. I was kind of nervous that he was going to come down and sub for Chico and all that, and we just clicked right away. So he took the gig, and that was the beginning of a long relationship. The other thing I remember about that gig was it was this little club nobody knew about, and there weren't many people there, but Saturday night at one of the front tables was Lauren Bacall, who was Chico knew all these people for goodness knows. And he introduced us, and we said, she was very gracious and very nice. But obviously I never saw Lauren again, but John I saw a lot. And then when I left New York, because I wanted some time to kind of cool out and get into the piano, and then I came back more or less 10 years later. John was right there in terms of just hanging out and so forth. And we didn't necessarily play right away.
Let me ask you something. I'm curious about the idea of the experimentation with adding electronic processors like a wah pedal. I mean, John was one of the first cats to experiment using a wah pedal in, I guess you would say, a jazz context. How did you become? I find this fascinating. During your alto sax period, I mean, did you add the wah pedal or these electronic processors to the alto? How did that come about?
Well, Randy and I were the two guys. Mike wasn't using it that much. He later played the Sealy, which was a wind synthesizer, but that was years and years later.
Right.
Randy and I were the two guys doing that. And we would talk about, what are you using? I'm using a boomerang wah-wah and an Echoplex and this and that. We'd trade equipment tips. But it got to a point where I was getting into writing certain kinds of tunes and certain harmonies and were involved in those tunes. And I couldn't get the sound I wanted out of the saxophone, either electronically or otherwise. So then I ended up switching to piano, and the thing that makes this apropos talking about John is John had quite a bit to do with that. And I say that because I think at the end of the day, I have a harmonically oriented kind of ear, and I'm interested in that sort of direction. And I'm sure I was going to end up there sooner or later. But John came on Chico's gig, and after a month or so, I just felt like, this is a guy who's exactly where I want to be. He's not flashy.
Right.
He's not interested in, being the hippest, fastest, most electric guitar player. He just wants to play hip. He wants to play good notes, good chords. He wants to swing. And, my thought was, I wish I could be like that, because I couldn't find that on the saxophone. And when I switched to the piano, then I found it. And so John was not only a close friend, but he was kind of an integral part of that switch, because he was the first example of a musician, and remains to this day one of the few musicians among my peers who kind of felt everything the way I did. And so
this is the question, because I'm producing a documentary on Stan Getz, and I'm going to Shadowbrook next weekend. And the truth is that Stan was a Beatle. I mean, he knocked the Beatles off the pop charts at one point. But like Steve Kuhn who played with Stan, said Stan was not an innovator of the music, and I agree, and I understand what he's saying. Do you believe John? I mean, again, we're not talking about a guy who was like monster facility guy. Never was he an innovator on the guitar, and if so, why?
Well, I think he was an innovator with the music.
Yeah, any way you want to go on that.
Guitar.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, never mind the guitar. He
Sure.
was an innovator with the music, and just to put it in context. Although I'm the last one to want to pigeonhole people, but I think he had the sensibility of a younger Jim Hall, and all the stuff he did throughout his career, whether it was just playing straight guitar, which he did, in the last 10 years or so of his career, or maybe more, or earlier when he had the pedals and when he's playing a guitar synthesizer. He always had the same approach, which is hit notes, swing, not play too much, let the music stand for itself, unusual chord voicings, very much like Jim, but in a more modern context. There's a wonderful video I saw on YouTube. It might not be up there tomorrow, but I saw it a few times in the last month of John's quartet live at the Vanguard with Mike Brecker and Peter Erskine and Marc Johnson.
Right.
And I guess it was in 80-something. And I don't know who made the video. It's got Japanese graphics, so that's a hint. But it was. I was just tearing up watching it. I found it, a few days after John passed. I don't know. I just went on YouTube and I punched in John Abercrombie, and this thing came up. And I was just tearing up between John and Mike, and how good they sounded, and that they're both not around. And, here John was playing guitar synthesizer, but he wasn't playing it like a war toy. He was making real music with it. And he did that with everything he touched.
I feel grateful to have the opportunity to have interviewed him a few years ago. And the guy was he lived for playing. And I know you did you have the calling? How deep was your calling? I mean, you grew up in a bastion of, going back to Donald Duck Bailey and Reggie Workman and Mickey Roker, Coltrane, more and more Stanley Clarke. All those cats came from Philly. So
yeah.
When did you know that the calling was so real that you couldn't do anything else in your life?
Well, there's an answer to that. It's not really short, but I'll try and keep it short.
Dude, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show, man.
Yeah, I understand. But the long and short of it is, since I was in the high school with Mike Brecker as a saxophonist, and Mike was killing when he was 16, 17 years old.
Absolutely.
His brother was a trumpet player, his father was an attorney, but he was actually a very accomplished jazz pianist. And he taught both his sons, So I just, I was overwhelmed because, I didn't have that kind of background. I got a much slower start, and I just assumed, look, this is what a real musician is like, and I don't have that. But I love it. But isn't it a shame I'll have to do something else? And I went off to New York to go to school after high school, and through a almost comedic set of references, somebody gave me, I wanted to study with somebody in New York, and some musician whom I won't name gave me a name almost as a gag, and I got passed around from one or two people to another. And finally I got this guy on the phone, and I believe his name was, I think his name was Bill Shiner.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I think so. And he said, well, what are you trying to do? I said, well, I feel like I've got a handle on bebop, which, by the way, was not true. That's what I felt like, but I didn't. And I said, but I feel like I'd like to put the extensions on. And he said, oh, you need to go see Lenny Tristano. I said, who's that? So he just said, well, just go see him. He gave me the number. I called up Lenny. I had no idea who he was. You know, there was no internet to look him up.
Sure. He was at Berkeley at that time.
Yeah, I mean, he was in Queens.
He's in Queens. Wow.
Yes, he lived in Queens. And so I took the IND train out there, the old straw seats. I mean, this was in 1966. And I came in and he said, what do you want to play? And, you know, I'd been like learning some bird licks and stuff like that. I said, let's play Just Friends. So we played it. And we got done and he said, okay. And he just spent 10 minutes just whittling me down to nothing. He said, you think you're real hot stuff coming in here playing all these bird licks. So I played with Bird. I know what he was about. He wasn't about learning somebody else's stuff. That's not improvising. And I'm sitting over there getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And Lenny was blind, you know. So he's padding around without sunglasses. One eye looked a little funny. And I just felt like, you know, I was getting destroyed. And then he turns to me with a grin on his face, and he says, but I think you got something. Let's come back next week. So, you know, I was ready to like run through a wall for this guy. And to make a long story short, I mean, there's a lot of Tristano acolytes, and because I studied with Lenny for a year and a half to 2 years, I have my idea what I think he was about, and I don't think the Tristano acolytes really have it. And what he was about is he taught me a way to figure out how to train the neuromuscular network and the inner ear to really be a tool to create musically. That's the best way I can state it. And, you know, I used some of what he taught me, not everything by any means, but I used some of his approach for years with students. And I have to say, if a student did the work, it never failed, you know, never. So I think he really understood what it took to play. And here's the end of the story. You know, here I was, you know, my yardstick had been Mike Brecker. I couldn't compete. I thought there's no way I'm going to become a musician. After about a year with him, I thought, you know, maybe I can do this. Maybe. And that's when it really started to sink in. From there was kind of no turning back.
Can I, you know, it reminds me, I'm just curious, like with, when I interviewed the pianist Marc Levine, he was up at Berkeley. He didn't even go to Berkeley, but it was so loose and casual. He just wound up befriending Jackie Byard and was getting lessons from him. And as you know, Jackie was a great drummer. And Marc would come in for a lesson, and he'd say, okay, let's play Cherokee in all 12 keys. And then, you know, about, I don't know, the D or wherever, you know, Marc would fall apart. And Jackie would say, okay, now you know what your homework is for the rest of the week. And the larger point is it's learning how to play a tune in every key. And I'd like you to talk about that experience. Did Tristano, with Just Friends, for instance, I mean, he was giving you some tough love, but did you work this idea of unlocking the ear and playing a tune in every key? Did he do that with you?
No. And remember, I was studying saxophone. I was basically studying principles of improvisation.
Right.
Because Lenny was not a sax player, you know. So I kind of know some things about the way he taught pianists, but it was just a general, here's what you need to do to learn to hear and to learn to play. And what I can say is that I think he really understood that. I think he understood how the body works. And the way, at least I used the method, and I don't know that everybody used it the way I did, but it was very non-directive, you know, so I used the principles he laid out, to examine any kind of jazz playing I wanted to get into. And after, like I say, after a year and a half, I realized, wow, my engine's all tuned up. I'm ready to go. And at that point, we parted company amicably because, I was interested in some areas he wasn't. I was interested in Coltrane, he wasn't. But I think I think he was definitely indispensable in getting me prepped to go. Although, like I say, I probably with like the thing with John, I probably would have found my way one way or the other. But Tristano showed me a way that I think really makes sense. And
it's kind of a revelation to me to hear this. It's actually really therapeutic, and you carried that through. Why you're talking about Coltrane at that time? He just wasn't getting off on what he was doing at that point in his career.
Well, look, Lenny had one cardinal rule for playing jazz, and that was that good jazz has a certain kind of development of a melodic line. Period. End of story. He didn't care about harmony, although he could play some chords. I mean, there's some ballads he did on Candid label and a couple other things. They're just like, 20 years ahead of their time, ironically.
Wow.
But he didn't care. He didn't care. His whole thing was about the lines. The way he played that Lee Konitz and Warren Marsh and Billy Bauer, all them kind of went in that direction. And, Lee was maybe the best-known exponent of that and a real good one. But that's what Lenny was into. So, Coltrane was different. And, Coltrane was into, like, working in certain things harmonically and opening up new ways of structuring lines and a different melodic aesthetic. So, for example, I remember I was listening to Giant Steps once with Lenny, and I said, "Isn't that great?" And he said, "It's terrible." I said, "What are you talking about, man? This is like unbelievable." He said, "Do you know how many times he played that one phrase?" And I said, "What do you mean, the one that goes da 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 da?" It's this one thing. And I said, "No, how many?" And Lenny said, 11 times, or whatever it is, however many times he did. And to Lenny, that was a cardinal sin. It meant you're repeating yourself. Now, Giant Steps was great because it's a whole new set of changes and a whole different way to play. But that didn't matter to him. What mattered to him was repetition is no good. It means you're running out of ideas. So within the boundaries of Lenny's aesthetic, he was right. But, of course, if you step outside that for a minute, he wasn't right at all. So that's kind of why I left. But I had tremendous respect for him as a musical thinker. And, his whole thing influenced a whole bunch of people. I'm sure Wayne was aware of that school of playing. I'm sure Herbie was, and so forth and so on.
Talking to Marc Copland here on the Jake Feinberg Show, live from Germany. This is, I really want you to talk about this because I'm, as a Gen Xer and younger cats, the millennials, et cetera, I really don't believe that musical vocabulary can grow in academia. I think it only grows on the bandstand. And I think one of the reasons you guys were so adaptable to all styles of music and were able to, and your ears were wide open, was because you were playing, upholstered sewers or clubs 6 nights a week, maybe a month at a time. You had a lot of bandstand experience. But I want the Marc Copland sort of philosophy about the R word, rehearsal. And the idea that you come in, you do as little rehearsing as possible, and also a time when you how comfortable you are just either as a leader or as a sideman when you're presented chord changes with no arrangements, and it just leaves a lot of space for improvisation. You can riff on that any way you want.
Well, let's see. I mean, I'm starting in the middle here, but I was very good friends with saxophonist and producer, composer Bob Belden for many years.
Mm-hmm.
The late Bob Belden.
Rest in peace.
Yeah. And Bob had a big band in New York that I was in for many years, and it was a very good band. Jay Anderson and Jeff Hirschfield were in the rhythm section, and a lot of great horn players, and I just remember there was a certain point, we do various gigs at little clubs in the village, and there was a certain point we had a few weekends or a steady one night, I can't remember which, but at Visiones, which was down the block from the Blue Note. It's a blues club now. And it got to the point where Bob would hand out parts to everybody. We just read the stuff on the gig.
Right.
Because the cats in the band were that good. And I'd say, Bob, where's my part? And he'd just look at me with this, crazy grin and say, just react.
React, exactly.
Just react. Exactly. And he knew, because now, you can't do this with everything, but he knew we knew each other well enough that I could anticipate what he wanted. And it worked out fine. And, when that can happen, that's the best. But the other side of it is to be able to do that, takes a lot of homework and a lot of preparation in terms of, your ears have to be real good, your response time has to be good, all that kind of stuff.
Don't you need the live experience to fall down and in order to learn that? I mean, you can practice all you want in isolation, but isn't it the live experience in the group and maybe falling down, and then what you need to do, in order to free yourself?
No question. I mean, you need both. And I do worry sometimes. I've talked with my peers. We're all like in our late 60s and 70s now.
Right.
And we worry about the younger cats. Where are they going to get the chance to do that kind of thing? Because we were out with bands as sidemen playing 4 or 5 nights a week. And that's very rare now. On the other hand, a lot of the younger players are really accomplishing remarkable things, but their experience is very different. They've been able to grow up with computers and use them, and computers didn't exist when I was learning to play. So it's all different. But I think in the end, a creative musician is going to find a creative way to learn.
We have a game on this program called Name That Voice. I want you to take a listen to this voice and then and the content of what he's talking about, and then we'll come back and break it down.
Okay.
Well, they got to get they got to play, and that's in the end. I mean, whatever we teach or say is really secondary to the process of being on the stage hopefully with somebody that's more experienced, which is what I provide to these younger musicians. And when they get on stage, they start to see what timing is, what drama is, storytelling, inflection, attitude, blah, blah, blah. All kinds of stuff that you really can't teach. You can put a record on from the past and say so-and-so exhibited this and that, and, use of space, use of dynamics, etc. But until the actual student gets on a stage in front of people, and hopefully with musicians of another generation, they're not going to really get it. And unfortunately these days, with masters pretty much, that period of jazz pretty much done, most of the young musicians play with young musicians. And that has its advantages and its disadvantages, and experience, of course, is lacking in that respect.
All right, Mr. Copland, who is that?
Dave Liebman.
That was from my...
I knew right away.
Yeah, right. And we let in with a track of you and Liebman and Billy Hart from 2010 overseas somewhere. But the reason I bring that up is the idea of these being able to play with people that from a different generation. And when you did start to work on the piano, I just wanted you to talk about the essence and the intrinsic qualities of people like Blue Mitchell and Harold Land and Curtis Fuller and these guys, and maybe some what was most inspiring to you, like what because like he was saying, you can play the record and point out these things, but there's nothing like being in the moment on the bandstand, and especially with the jazzers, the cats I mentioned, Blue Mitchell and Harold Land. These guys to me are like, I mean, I just would love to know what you learned from them on the bandstand.
Well, I mean, I should describe my situation, right?
Sure.
There I was in New York, a saxophonist, and I decided to switch at 25. And, New York was full of good piano players. And I felt like I had something very particular I heard and that I knew was going to be right for me. But, nobody was calling me in New York. And I remember I had a long conversation about it with my friend, the late David Earl Johnson, who was a drummer and conga player and also bartender at Bradley's. And David Earl said, man, cats are going to be suspicious of the second acts, And he was right. And I ended up getting a call from Washington, D.C., and was in a band there, very good players. And so I ended up moving down, and I spent 10 years down there. Now, I was in an interesting position because I knew tons of cats from New York, but I was in Washington, which basically means Washington and Baltimore.
Right.
They're right next door to each other. So you got two large cities. And, when I got to town, I was pretty much already, kind of, there weren't really many great players down there, so I had a leg up on all that. I was big fish in a smaller pond. Plus, I knew all the cats in New York. So I went through, in addition to doing just local club gigs with local bands, I went through, one club after the other. There was a couple in Baltimore. There was the one step down in Washington. There was Blues Alley in Washington, which is still going. Where at each of these clubs, I'd be a house pianist. And I'd put together the rhythm sections with local guys, and I'd play with whoever came down. And more often than not, these people booking these clubs would come to me and say, "Who should we get?" So I had like the luxury of like being able to back up way more people than probably most piano players in New York my age or even 10 or 15 years younger, because I was getting a little late start. Way more. So, for example, I didn't have the experience of playing with Stan Getz in his band. I didn't have the experience of playing with Art Farmer in his band. But I did have the experience of playing 2, 3, 4 times a week at a shot with Art, with Curtis Fuller, as you said, with Harold Land and Blue Mitchell, with Harold Vick, with Bob Mintzer, with Bob Berg, with Randy Brecker, with Dave Liebman. On and on and on and on. Tom Harrell.
Sonny Stitt.
Sonny Stitt, yes, Stitt actually, that was very interesting because the guy who was booking Blues Alley at that time is now the guy who owns, and for many years has owned Jazz Alley in Seattle, which is a terrific club. And we became friendly. So he hired me as house pianist. And, I did a couple, I forget who they were, it might have been Irby Green, somebody else. And then Sonny comes in, and I wasn't ready, okay, because I was like into my 60s Herbie time no changes kind of thing,
right.
Medium tempos, and Sonny came in and was playing like, 5-flat blues, Cherokee Lightning Fast, you name it. So my friend called me up, John Demetriou. He called me up about 6 months later. He said, all right, I got Sonny coming in again. I said, yeah. He said, look, he asked me for another piano player. I said, Sonny, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to give this guy one more chance. He said to me, don't mess this up. So I started doing my homework. And, you know, Sonny could be kind of a gruff character, you know. So I came in there, I was ready, but boy, I didn't know what the vibes were going to be like or anything.
Sure.
And I was very happy to be able to cut the music and make it and be able to comp behind him to make him comfortable. But I also didn't want to back off of playing my own thing, which was harmonically, you know, a little more contempo at the time than what he was doing. So all I can tell you is we get through 2 nights of a 5-night run, 6-night run, and he comes up to me and he says, Mark, he says, don't let anybody tell you it matters whether you're black or white. All that matters is whether you can play. And he gave me a big smile. And so he had basically letting me know I'd made the cut. And the next the next night, we get up on the bandstand after the first set, and he's warming up with a couple phrases, and I'm warming up with a couple phrases. And he walks over to me with this grin, and he says, man, what's that crazy shit you're playing? In a compliment with a smile, you know. So he asked for me every time for the next 5-6 years till he died of cancer. And I loved him. He was a great guy, and he was about the last guy stylistically you would have put me with. And there's a thing where he threw down the gauntlet, and I did my homework, and he respected that, you know.
Do you have, taking that story, which is so powerful and speaks to the intergenerational magic of music, do you have that opportunity today? Maybe you're not the same kind of gruff attitude, but do you have that opportunity today with younger cats to be able to look at them and grin it and say, you're playing your butt off, just keep going?
Well, it's different. You know, the whole work dynamic is different. I mean, I'm not in exactly the same position. That said, you know, like, for example, I was in Montreal Trio end of September. Now, the bassist, who's in his early 40s, has been a friend of mine for 8, 9 years, 10 years, named Adrian Vidati. So he doesn't count. But the drummer, whose name is Jim Doxas, who I think is probably late 30s. So, you know, we're not talking about kids.
No.
On the other hand, he's 30, 35 years younger than me, right? So Jim is playing on drums. And this was just, you know, a decision that Adrian reached. He said, this is probably the guy we want to try this with. And I said, okay, because I played with a few drummers in Canada in the last few years. And I know Abercrombie liked Jim. So that was a, you know, big vote in his favor. And, you know, I would say Jim learned a lot, but I would say I didn't really tell him anything verbally. Because I'm of the opinion, and there were some things, Adrian and I talked about it after the first night. We were like, yeah, it was pretty good, but then there was this issue and there was that issue. And I was thinking, should I say something to Jim? And then in the end I thought, no, I'm going to do like I always do. Anything I have to say, I'm going to say from the piano. And particularly in a trio situation, you can communicate musical values to the other musicians by the way you play and the way you react. Here's an easy example. Now, this is not Jim. I'm thinking of somebody else right now.
Sure.
But let's say the drummer is playing too loud. I immediately start playing softer. And if the guy's listening at all, he's going to come down because he's going to realize he's drowning you out.
Right.
If the guy's not leaving enough space, stop playing or play less. They'll go about 2 bars and they'll go, what? And they'll pull way back. And that's a way of saying, hey, listen to me, listen to where I'm trying to go. But you don't have to say anything verbally. And to be honest, if I feel like I have to say something verbally, I'm not doing my job.